we've got 4 different vertebrae here. These vertebrae are from the 4 different vertebral regions within the vertebral column. And one of the things that we should notice is that they look pretty similar to one another, with the exception sort of this oddball over here. This is the sacrum, and we're actually missing the coccyx on this image. But if you take the sacrum and you turn it like so, you'll see that it actually does closely resemble the other 3 types of vertebra. So I want to run through the vertebra of the different regions individually so that you can see what's unique to each of the regions. We have a cervical vertebra over on the right. We have a thoracic vertebra, a lumbar vertebra, and then those fused vertebrae that make up the sacrum over here. Again, remember, we do also have coccygeal vertebra, and they're not going to be shown in this video. All of these vertebrae are going to share a couple things in common. The first is that they all contain a spinous process, and even our sacrum has some spinous processes on it. They're all going to contain a vertebral body, vertebral body, vertebral body, vertebral body. They're all going to have a big hole in the middle of them. Now remember, foramen is the word for hole, and because this foramen is in the middle of a vertebra, we're going to call it a vertebral foramen. And that's where the spinal cord is going to sit, so it's important that that foramen is present in every single one of our vertebrae. Notice also that our vertebrae have some processes that stick off to the side, here, here, and there. And those are going to be attachment places mostly for muscles, but also for different ligaments that are holding your spinal cord and your vertebral column and your thoracic cage together. I'm going to go ahead and move the sacrum, our oddball, out for a moment, and let's get a closer look here at the remaining 3 vertebrae. Oh, sorry, we'll go in. All right, here we go. So again, sticking out this way is the spinous process, and that's going to point posteriorly. So that's going to identify the posterior side of the vertebra compared to the anterior side of the vertebra here. The vertebral body sits anteriorly, and then sitting off to the side, we have 2 transverse processes. And it doesn't matter what vertebral region you're in, those things are going to be common to all vertebrae. We also have the hole, which is called our vertebral foramen, and again, that's where the spinal cord sits. Other things that all vertebrae are going to share in common are going to be a vertebral arch, and that vertebral arch is going to completely surround and protect the spinal cord. And that vertebral arch is going to span from the vertebral body here around to the other vertebral body. So it makes an arch from here to here. And on this vertebra, from here to here, from here to here. And then those processes that we were just talking about are going to stick off of that vertebral arch. So the spinous process is attached to the vertebral arch. My 2 transverse processes are attached to the vertebral arch. The vertebral arch has 2 different parts to it. The superior portion that makes the top of the arch is called a lamina. So there's a lamina here and a lamina there. Those are the 2 lamina. I could think about the lamina as being the space between the spinous process and the transverse process, so that's going to be my lamina. Pedicle is going to form the foot of the arch, so go to your roots. Remember that ped means foot. A pedestal is a footstool. A pedicure is a special treatment for your feet. So ped means foot, and the pedicle is the foot of the arch. And I see that here and here. Pedicle, pedicle, lamina, lamina. Pedicle, pedicle, lamina, lamina. Pedicle, pedicle, lamina, lamina. Excellent. Other things that all vertebrae are going to have in common include articular processes and articular facets. Now, the difference between a process and a process is something that sticks out. A spinous process, a transverse process. These ones that stick up are called articular process. So an articular process, an articular process. Sometimes it helps to turn the vertebra sideways to see those processes better. So this would be an articular process. There's another one over here, and there's one on the bottom and one on the bottom here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 articular processes. And if we think about the name, it's going to tell us what those articular processes do. They're going to articulate, and articulate means form a joint. So these articular processes are going to form a joint or articulate with the vertebra above it. So the vertebra will stack together with the superior articular processes of one vertebra connecting to the inferior articular processes of the vertebra above it, like so. Now, each of these articular processes does have a very, very smooth spot on it. And recall that a flat, smooth spot on a bone is called a facet, and it's an articulation point where that bone is going to be connecting with another bone. So each of our processes, the process is the whole thing that I can pinch here, has a facet or a smooth spot. So I was showing you those using our thoracic vertebra, but we can also see them very clearly on our lumbar vertebra. So these two processes that stick up superiorly are superior articular processes with some facets. And then the two that stick inferiorly are the inferior articular process. And again, they also have facets on them. We can see these again on our cervical vertebra. We have two superior articular processes and facets, and then we have two on the bottom, two inferior articular facets and processes. Excellent. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the 4 different vertebrae from 4 different regions and look at the defining characteristics. What makes this a cervical vertebra? Well, to answer that question, we're going to take a look at a couple other cervical vertebrae. Let's see. So that's a cervical vertebra. Here's another cervical vertebra. I have a big bag of vertebrae over here. It's pretty wild. Another cervical vertebra. Here's a cervical vertebra. And each of these vertebrae, if you take a look in their transverse processes, here and here, here and here, here and here, there and there, they all have these holes. So they all have holes in their transverse processes, and we call these transverse foramina. Remember that a foramen is a hole, so foramina is the plural for holes. Now I'm going to bring in a thoracic vertebra here. Notice that that thoracic vertebra is lacking holes in the transverse processes. Every single cervical vertebra has holes in the transverse processes with no exception. All 7 of them have those holes. So if on the exam someone asks you, what region does this vertebra belong to? You can take a look at it and immediately tell that it is a cervical vertebra because of those transverse foramina. These holes are in place for an artery that goes up through your neck and through the bottom of your skull into your brain. It's called the vertebral artery, which is kind of convenient seeing as how it runs through the vertebra. All right, next up, let's look at the defining characteristics for our thoracic vertebra. So here's our thoracic vertebra. We'll throw a couple more thoracic vertebra into our field of view. Here's another thoracic vertebra from the side. Another thoracic vertebra. So these 3 are all thoracic vertebra, and we can tell that they're thoracic vertebra because they have a unique feature on them that allows them to connect to the ribs. So all 12 thoracic vertebra connect to the 12 ribs, and they are going to have attachment spots for those ribs or articulation spots. Now remember that a flat articular surface is called a facet, so we're going to look for facets on these thoracic vertebrae. The facets are going to be located on the vertebral bodies, and they're going to be located on the transverse process. So let's get a little bit closer to our vertebra here and see what we can see. All right, let's look at this one first. What I see here is on this transverse process, there's a flat spot right there. That is a costal facet, an attachment spot for a costa or for a rib. So costal facet, attachment spot for ribs. Only thoracic vertebrae have these. I see another one here and one there. So 1, 2, 3 on this side. And if I flip it over to this side, I get 1, 2, 3 costal facets. It's a thoracic vertebra. Now let's change this out for one of our other thoracic vertebrae, and we'll again look for those costal facets. So there's a costal facet on the transverse process, a nice flat spot, and then I see some costal facets here on the body. And if I flip it over to the other side, again, a costal facet, and then two costal facets there, a thoracic vertebra. Those costal facets are only present on our thoracic vertebra. All right, next up. Here. This is a lumbar vertebra. Let's throw over a couple other lumbar vertebrae. Here's another lumbar vertebra. And here's a lumbar vertebra. We have a total of 5 lumbar vertebrae, and they share some things in common. They tend to be very large. They're the largest of the vertebrae with the exception, of course, of our sacrum. And the reason they're so large is because they're carrying more weight. So what you'll notice as you go down through the vertebral column is that the vertebral bodies are going to increase in size as you get lower in the vertebral column. And that's because the lower vertebrae are carrying more weight than the higher vertebrae are. However, you have to be careful because this isn't going to be consistent between 2 different people. So for example, my thoracic vertebral bodies may look really similar to the cervical vertebral bodies of a large guy. So if you have all the vertebrae of a single person, you could use body size as a way to figure out what region you're in. But really the best way to tell that these are lumbar vertebrae is by ruling out cervical and thoracic vertebrae first. So we're kind of going to define them based on their absence of features. So let's get a little bit closer to these vertebrae. And we want to look for the defining characteristics of cervical and thoracic vertebrae to rule those vertebrae out. So here we are on exam day. This is the vertebra sitting in front of you on that table. And we look at it, and the first thing we check for is we look at the transverse processes here and here. Do we see holes in them? We do not. So we know that it's not a cervical vertebra. The next thing that we're going to do is look for costal facets, attachment points for ribs. If we see a costal facet, we know it belongs in the thoracic region. So let's take a look at this. Okay, I flip it up, I look on that transverse process, I look on the vertebral body, and there are no costal facets. Therefore, kind of by default, it's a lumbar vertebra. And I'm going to see the exact same absence of structures, because I won't see those structures when I look at any lumbar vertebra. No transverse foramina, and no costal facets, no attachment points for ribs. Therefore, it's a lumbar vertebra. All right, next up, take just a second look at our sacrum. This is the anterior view of the sacrum, so that sacrum is going to curve anteriorly. So our anterior view, and then over here, the posterior view of our sacrum. We can tell that this is a posterior view of the sacrum because of the spinous processes, and remember that spinous processes are always going to point posteriorly. So the only vertebra that we are missing currently is our coccygeal vertebra, and I'm sure it's somewhere in this bone box, but I'm not finding it currently. So make sure you take a look at your textbook so that you get a nice view of that coccyx.